Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder if babies can tell if they like a voice? Well, new research dives into how tiny brains process familiar and unfamiliar voices and what it might mean for learning. Imagine trying to learn a whole new language just by listening. It is tough, right? Especially when every person has a slightly different way of saying things, a different voice, a different accent. How do babies who are just starting to figure out sounds manage to learn their native language despite all this variation? That is exactly what a team of researchers wanted to figure out. They were curious if the familiarity of a voice might help babies learn speech sounds, or phoneme. We know babies can recognize their mom's voice even before they're born. And as they grow, they seem to pay more attention to voices they know. In adults, it is easier to understand someone if you know their voice. So the big question for this study was, does this voice familiarity benefit also help very young babies understand speech sounds? And does it matter how the voice becomes familiar? Is it just the sound of the voice itself, or is it hearing specific speech sounds from that voice? To find out, scientists worked with 72 babies who were only 3 months old and learning to speak German. They used a two-part approach to make voices familiar. First, for 3 weeks, the babies listened to stories read by 2 different people at home. This was meant to make the general sound of these voices familiar to the baby. Think of it as the acoustic familiarity phase, where they just get used to the sound. Then, in the lab, the babies experienced the second part, phoneme training. Here they listen to a specific vowel sound contrast, like a subtle difference between 2 I sounds, played by a speaker. This was designed to create exemplar-based familiarity, where the baby hears specific speech sounds from a particular voice. The trick was, sometimes this training speaker was already from the home listening, and sometimes it was a completely new voice. After the training, the researchers tested how well the babies could tell the difference between these 2 vowel sounds. They did this by playing sounds to the babies and measuring their brain activity using EEG. They tested the baby's ability to hear the difference with 3 different speakers, the one who did the training, a familiar speaker from home who didn't do the training, and a completely new unfamiliar speaker. This setup allowed them to compare babies' brain responses to the same sounds spoken by familiar versus unfamiliar voices, and to see if the type of familiarity mattered. Now, for the findings, when babies were trained on the vowel sounds by a speaker they didn't know from home, they didn't show a special benefit when hearing those sounds from that unfamiliar speaker later on, even compared to a brand new speaker. This suggested that learning from an unfamiliar voice might actually push babies to focus on the sounds themselves, rather than the voice. It is like they're trying to get a general understanding of the sound that works for any voice. This supports an idea called abstractionist learning, where the brain tries to create general rules for sounds. But here is where it gets really interesting. When babies were trained on the vowel sounds by a speaker they did know from home and had also heard those specific sounds from this familiar voice in the lab, then they showed a benefit. Their brains reacted differently, suggesting they could better distinguish the sounds when spoken by this familiar trained voice. Critically, this benefit only showed up when the voice was familiar in both ways. They heard stories from the voice at home for acoustic familiarity, and they heard the specific vowel sounds from that voice during training for exemplar familiarity. Neither type of familiarity alone was enough to create this special advantage. So, what does this all mean? It points towards a hybrid model of how babies learn. It is not just one way or the other. It seems like babies can create general, abstract understandings of speech sounds that work across different voices, which is great for learning any language. But when a voice is familiar in a deeper way, both through general listening and through hearing specific speech, sounds from them babies can also become speaker sensitive. They can use that voice information to help them process sounds even better. It is like having 2 tools, one for general understanding and one for specific situations. This suggests that 3-month-old babies aren't just passively absorbing sounds. They're actively using voice information, but the way they use it might change depending on the situation. Training with an unfamiliar voice encourages them to generalize, while training with a familiar voice can encourage them to focus on speaker-specific details. This is a complex dance between learning general rules and paying attention to individual examples. Of course, no study is perfect. The researchers themselves mention a few things. For example, the test with the familiar but non-training speaker always happened last. This could have either helped babies learn more throughout the session or made them tired and less responsive. They also note that the specific sounds used for training might have been more or less distinct depending on the speaker. which could have influenced how easy it was for the babies to tell them apart. But the main takeaway is pretty exciting for 3-month-old babies. Voice familiarity can indeed help them understand speech sounds, but it is not just about recognizing a voice. It seems to require a combination of getting used to a voice generally and hearing specific speech examples from that voice. This shows that babies are already developing sophisticated ways of using voice information to learn their native language. And their learning system is flexible enough to switch between general learning and speaker-specific analysis. It's a fascinating glimpse into the early stages of language acquisition.